Network Dojo.
Now we come to the final style of guest WLANs that we might have to configure in the lab, and it's probably the biggest one by far, and that is central web authentication, leveraging ICE as the portal and policy engine for this. So this is different in compared to the ones that we've talked about before, where all of the policy processes are happening over on ICE, and the controller is configured to coordinate with it. So it's a new way of doing WebAuth that came about. I mean, it's been a while now. It's probably like 5 years or so since this has first come out. But it was introduced when ICE came out. So ICE was the first server to actually allow this type of a thing. So you're never going to see this without ICE. It's the most common guest solution that we saw starting in 3.0 of the lab, because that's where the ICE server was first introduced in the lab. And I have a hunch we're going to continue to see this to be one of the more dominant guest options that we have. Potentially, maybe a close second, or the next one would be Connect and Engage if they want to get into some more interesting CMX type stuff. But I still have a feeling this is probably going to be the dominant one. So it's the one that you want to be the most familiar with. And it's also one of the more complex ones because there's a lot of moving parts when we configure this. There's a lot of interactions between the controller and the ICE server, and so we want to make sure that we understand how all of this works. Now this video is going to focus on the controller side of the configurations. We'll look at the ICE side of the configurations in detail in the ICE series of videos. And in the lab you might actually see it broken up across two separate tasks. One task to configure sort of the controller side of the equation, and one side to configure more of the ICE portal side of the configuration. So again, a lot of moving parts. This video will focus on the controller side, and we'll assume that ICE is configured correctly. In the ICE videos, we'll look at all of that stuff there, so you won't miss out on anything. We'll tie it all in together. But as we look at the controller config, there's really three pieces of config that are important. We need to define ICE as a radius server with change of authorization support, or COA support. We'll talk about COA more in detail in the ICE series of videos, but do know that we need to enable COA support, and it is not enabled by default. Number two, we need a redirection ACL configured on the controller. The ICE server is going to invoke this ACL, but it must exist first on the controller. And finally, third, there will be the WLAN configuration needed to support this. So these three pieces of config, every single time, very important parts of these configs. And if we get any one of these three things wrong, something's going to fall apart. So let's work our way through this. I guess before we get to the config, let's actually map out how CWA works, because there's a multi-step process with things happening on both sides. So let's look at this, and this is going to hopefully make it so that you understand why we do the configs the way that we do. So in one side of the equation, we have the controller with APs down below and the client connecting up to that. Over here, we have ICE as our radius server. And the controller is configured to use the radius server here. All right, as we configure out our WLAN, the only auth on the security mechanism on the WLAN is MAC filtering. It's an Open SSID plus MAC filtering. There is nothing configured under the Layer 3 Auth tab. So clients will see it as an Open SSID, but when they connect, they have to complete a MAC auth, and we're going to configure the controller to send that MAC auth out to the radius server. And so every auth is going to be a MAC lookup on the radius server. So here's the flow. The client connects up to the AP. The controller then sends the first MAC auth over to the server. ICE will be configured to see, oh, this is coming in from this particular guest WLAN. This is going to be a central web auth. So it's going to respond back with two important pieces of information: a URL to redirect to, plus a redirection ACL name. So two important pieces of information: a URL to redirect the client to, and a redirection ACL name to apply to the client session. This is the completion of the first step of the process. So client connects up. We do a MAC auth check to the Radius server. The Radius server responds with a URL and an ACL name. At this point, the client moves into a central web auth state. The client is then able to pull its IP address. So this happens prior to the client even essentially being allowed to pull its IP address, but we complete the first auth. The client is then placed in a central web auth pending state, pulls its IP address, and then the client tries to pull up a web page, and it's going to get redirected to a portal on the ICE server. So very much like the local web auth process where the client pulls an IP address, tries to go to a web page, gets redirected. Same deal. It's just that happens after the initial MAC lookup. So the client's going to be talking to a web page on the Radius server. So the client will be redirected to the Radius server. The client must complete the portal. And there are a number of different types of portals that we can throw at the client, and that's irrelevant as far as the controller is concerned and how the process is concerned so far. We'll look at that in detail, but for now we're just going to say the client is redirected to the portal. The client then completes the portal, because all that's ICE stuff over there. So right now we're not worrying about what type of portal it is, but at the end of the day, they get to the end of the portal process. At the end of the portal process, we fire off a change of authorization request, COA request. And all a COA request says is, please reauth this client. Okay, so the controller accepts the COA request. It then sends another MAC auth. So this is the second MAC auth. The Radius server then responds with a permit. The client is now in a run state and is up and going on the network without any URL or ACL restrictions. So that's the process. So it's sort of multi-steps. Again, we're connecting up to an SSID that's an open SSID with MAC filtering turned on, and it's configured to use MAC auth against a Radius server. First MAC auth goes to the Radius server. Radius server responds with the redirection URL and ACL. Client gets up, pulls its IP address, tries to go to a web page, is redirected to the portal on the server. The client completes the portal process. At the completion of the portal process, the Radius server sends a COA request. The controller sends a second MAC auth for the same client. The Radius server then responds with a permit. The client has completed the CWA process. So, as we look at the configurations needed on the controller, we have the WLAN that the client is connecting to. We have ICE configured as a Radius server that supports COA, otherwise it's going to ignore this request. And we also need the redirection ACL that's going to be leveraged for this process. And so that's kind of where the three parts come in: the WLAN, the ACL, and Radius with COA support. All right, now we kind of have an idea of the process of central web auth. Let's go ahead and take a look at the controller configuration. The nice thing is it's the same config regardless of whatever portal is happening on the ICE server. That's irrelevant to the controller side of the config. It's the same config regardless. So, Radius server. We've looked at adding Radius servers before. Nothing special. The only thing that you need to change from the default is that support for COA is enabled, because by default, when you create a new server, it is disabled. So we do have to make sure to enable this. And this is one of the reasons why I just turn this feature on every time unless I'm told not to. But otherwise, we just need the IP, the shared secret, correct port, and COA support. Easy enough. Number two, we need that redirection ACL. Make sure you know how to write this in your sleep. So, we're going to create an ACL. Give it some name. This name is going to be invoked in an ICE policy, so this is going to have to match with what you configure ICE to respond back with. I always named mine redirect, but call yours what you want. So we're going to need 4 rules in here. We need to make sure that the client can use DNS and that the client can talk to the ICE portal server. So it's going to look very much like that pre-auth ACL that I configured in the last video. But let's just run through it. So, do we want to lock them down to using a specific DNS server or any DNS server? I typically just go generic and let them talk to any DNS server. So I just say, you know what, any source, any destination, but destination port of DNS. This would be an inbound rule. We need to permit. And then the DNS reply back. So this time, DNS would be the source in an outbound rule. So this allows two-way communication from the client to the DNS server and back. Next, we need to allow communication to the ICE portal server. So, 3. I can type. So this time the destination is actually the ICE server. 5. We're using TCP. ICE by default uses port 8443 on its portal, and you should call that out. Technically, you could just generically say any TCP. The only problem is there that then they can pull up the management GUI of the ICE server. You probably don't want that. So this is the appropriate way to configure the portal without giving them access to managing the ICE server. That would be an inbound permit, and then the response. So we always kind of write these in pairs. So this time it's going to be coming from the ICE server. Still TCP, but the source port now is 8443, standard portal port. That would be an outbound rule, permit. So obviously in the lab, the IP will be different, but know this. Have this memorized, and you should be able to rattle it off very quickly. Now you might have to adapt to this. Maybe they want more stuff allowed prior to authentications. Maybe they want you to only specify a specific DNS server. That's okay, but this structure here will always be there. You might add more specifics to this. You might add extra stuff if they ask for extra stuff, but this core will always be there. Know this and have it memorized. Okay, so my redirection ACL. And I don't apply it to anything. It must exist on the controller. And then it will be invoked in those the response to that initial MAC auth that we saw. So we're not actually going to apply this anywhere. It just must exist. And it must be named the same as what the policy calls. Finally, the WLAN. I'm going to create a new one from scratch here. So I'll call it guest 3. All right, so there's going to be a few key pieces of configuration on here. Probably need to turn it on. Yes, assign it to an interface. But on the security side, it's an open SSID with MAC filtering. Open SSID, MAC filtering, nothing on layer 3. ICE as our radius server. AAA override enabled, otherwise we're not going to accept the URL redirect in the ACL name. And we need to come in and say on the NAC state, ICE-NAC. Otherwise, it's not going to understand that we're doing CWA. This allows the controller to know, oh yeah, we're doing CWA with the ICE server, so I'm going to do the CWA stuff. So again, the important parts of this. Yes, turn it on. Yes, assign it to an interface, but it's an open SSID with MAC filtering, nothing on layer 3. ICE is your radius server, AAA override enabled, ICE-NAC. That's your core. They might ask you to do more, and that's fine. You know, session timeouts, DHCP address required. That's just extra stuff, and that's fine if they ask for that. But know the core things that need to be there. Okay, So now I have those three things. I have a radio server that supports COA. I have my redirection ACL all ready to go, and I have my WLAN configured correctly. Let's go ahead and test this out. ICE is already configured for its side, so we're not going to worry about that. So I'm going to connect up to guest 3 once I finally see it. Do a quick repair. All right, so I'm going to connect. Before I even pull this IP address, we've already completed the first MAC auth. So I connect. Controller sends the MAC auth out to the radio server. The radio server responds with the URL and the redirection ACL name. I am then placed onto the network, and I should be able to pull my IP address. So if I look at my client state, oh, you know what? I got a bad piece of config from earlier. Let me fix this. I still had a MAC entry, a local MAC auth entry for my client that's going to mess me up here. So definitely we don't want any local entries. Which, apologies, that's from a previous video. Let's reconnect, sorry. Try again. All right, so we connect, we do the MAC lookup, Radius responds back with the URL, the ACL name. In this point, I'm in a central web auth state. I should be able to pull my IP address this time, assuming, there we go. Let's take a look at our client state before I even move anywhere forward. And I have to look in the CLI now because I can't use the GUI while I'm in this state, even if I had management via wireless turned on. But if we take a look here, we're not fully in a run state yet. Let's take a look at the detail stats here, which actually I already have it up here. Okay, so as we scroll down, I want to point out a couple things. So one, we are in a central web auth. So this is different than the web auth required. It knows that we're doing CWA thanks to that ISNAC process. So AAA with ISNAC, we understand that we're doing central web auth. We see that we have an ACL called redirect applied to our session, and we have the URL. So these are the things that we learned from the controller, or from ICE. We got the URL, we got the redirect ACL name, we got the URL, and I believe due to the formatting of the URL, the controller was able to deduce that we're doing central web auth. Okay, so that's where we're at now. At the completion of the first MAC auth check, I've also pulled my IP address. Now I should be able to try to go to a web page and get redirected to the ICE server. So note, by default, it is redirecting me to the DNS name of the ICE server on port 8443, so make sure that your client knows DNS. And now I'm on the portal. So this is the part where I complete the portal. So this is all ICE stuff. So the controller is just waiting, sitting around. So I just need to complete the portal. So I'm going to log in, continue. Okay, so this page is the completion of the portal process. At the completion of the portal process, ICE sends the COA request. The controller responds to that, sends a new MAC auth lookup to the ICE server. ICE server then responds back with a permit, and now I should be in a run state. So if I look at my client state now, I should be in a run state, and the ACL and redirection URL have been removed. So here we go. I'm in a run state. I no longer have an ACL applied, and I no longer have a URL redirection. I'm fully complete and up and running on the network now. So that's what we're going to see through the course of this process. If I look at ICE and take a look at the ICE logs, we'll see all those steps that I talked about. So again, a lot of moving parts, and we haven't even looked at the moving parts on the ICE side of the configuration. We're only looking at the controller so far. So in the ICE section of the videos, we'll definitely see all the ICE parts that need to be working. But here we go. So we have, this should be the first one. So here is the first auth. It is a MAC-based auth. So it's going to be a MAC lookup. So we just based it off of the MAC address. ICE was configured as such to understand what's going on, and it sent back this Cisco AV pair to say, okay, apply a redirection ACL called redirect, and apply this URL redirect. That gave us what we need. Client pulled its IP address, was redirected to the ICE server. As I went through the portal process, I had to put that username password into the portal. That's this entry right here. So this is the validation of the credentials that I supplied in the ICE portal itself. So it knows that I put in this username, and it validated the password and said, oh, yep, we completed the portal authentication. The next entry is the COA request here. So we don't see a username, but if we look at the details, I completed the portal. ICE sent a COA request. And so if you ever see the word dynamic authorization, translate that to COA, change of authorization. So dynamic authorization succeeded. This is the COA request. And then we got the second MAC lookup inside of here. And so we see so we're hitting the MAB rule, which means it was a MAC-based lookup. We are seeing the username associated with this overall process, which can kind of muddy the waters. Was this a user auth lookup? Was it a MAC auth lookup? It was the MAC check is what it was, but it's the second one inside of here. And so at the end of the day, it just sent back a general permit. So permit access is what it sent. This got us into our full run state. So you can see the step-by-step in the logs of the overall process that we called out within inside here. All of those configurations important in making the various steps of this process work. So if you haven't practiced CWA much, probably want to review this a few times. It's definitely very common in the lab. It's going to be something that you want to make sure that you understand how to make work. Now, I won't actually make it work in the anchoring scenario, but let's talk about this in an anchoring scenario. Are there any special caveats to know if we are anchoring a guest WLAN and it's a CWA-based WLAN? So the normal anchor config applies. So we need the WLAN on both the foreign and the anchor controller. We need to make sure mobility group memberships are up. We need to make sure that the WLANs are configured identically for each other. All the normal anchoring type stuff that we've talked about in the anchoring video. But a couple things to keep in mind. Where's the auth coming from? Who's talking to the radius server? Well, if you remember the anchoring video, layer 2 auth comes from the foreign controller, layer 3 auth comes from the anchor controller. What type of authentication is this? Well, it's a layer 2 auth. When we look at the WLAN, what did we turn on? We turned on MAC filtering. That's a layer 2 auth. We didn't turn anything on the layer 3 tab. And so it's the foreign controller. That would be the one communicating to the ICE server. Where does the ACL need to be applied? That redirection ACL, where does it need to exist? The answer is on both controllers. It must exist on the foreign controller and it must exist on the anchor controller. Because it's the anchor controller that applies it, because the anchor controller is the one dropping it off onto the wired network. So all ACL work is enforced on the anchor controller. But in order for the anchor controller to get it, the foreign controller becomes sort of a middleman for the anchor controller, which is applying policy, but the foreign controller is the one talking to the ICE server. And so the foreign controller sends the MAC lookup to the ICE server sends the URL and the ACL name to the foreign controller then forwards that information up to the anchor controller. It will not forward the ACL name to the anchor controller if the foreign controller doesn't also have the ACL configured. Now, a quick time-saving tip, you don't actually have to configure any rules on the foreign controller. You could just have an ACL called redirect, no rules on the foreign controller, create the redirect ACL on the anchor controller with all the rules, and everything would work just fine. But if you want to do extra work, you could put the rules on both the foreign and the anchor. Does the anchor controller need to have ICE configured as a radius server? Not really, because it's not directly talking to the ICE server. So as you configure the WLANs, yeah, I mean, it doesn't hurt to configure ICE as a radius server on the anchor controller and call it out on the WLAN. You don't have to, but it doesn't hurt either. But those would be the important parts. Make sure that the redirection ACL exists on both the foreign and the anchor. It's the anchor rules that apply, though the foreign rules are irrelevant. The foreign controller is the one talking to the controller because this is a layer 2 based authentication. And then on top of that, all the normal anchoring stuff is also required as well. So anchoring, very common in a guest style WLAN, so make sure that you practice this both standalone as well as in an anchoring scenario.